My 22-year-old grandson looked me straight in the eye and said the world would be better without old people like me taking up space, that I should just die already and stop being a burden on everyone around me. So I decided to give him exactly what he wanted and faked my own death, complete with a funeral service where I watched from the back row as he celebrated my passing and tried to claim my inheritance before my body was even cold. What happened when I revealed myself at the reading of my will destroyed him completely and taught him a lesson about respecting his elders that he'll never forget. I'm Walter. I'm 78 years old, and this is the story of how my cruel grandson's wish for my death became the biggest mistake of his entitled life. Before we dive deeper into this tale, please hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us which country you're listening from today. You know, there's something particularly heartbreaking about being told by your own flesh and blood that you're worthless and should disappear from their lives, especially when that person is someone you helped raise and supported through their most difficult years. This story is about family betrayal, the cruelty of youth, and what happens when someone who thinks they can treat elderly people like disposable objects discovers that some old folks have more fight left in them than anyone could imagine. It's about the sweet satisfaction of watching someone reveal their true character when they think no one important is watching, and about the lesson that respect for your elders isn't just good manners. It's essential for maintaining the bonds that hold families together. Let me take you back to the beginning of this story, back when I still believed that my grandson Tyler was just going through a difficult phase and would eventually mature into a decent human being, instead of the selfish, heartless young man he'd become. I'm a retired construction company owner who spent 50 years building homes and commercial buildings throughout our state, creating a successful business that employed hundreds of people and contributed millions of dollars to our local economy. I worked my way up from a laborer with nothing but a strong back and a willingness to learn, to owning one of the most respected construction companies in the region. Along the way, I accumulated significant wealth and property, but more importantly, I built a reputation for fairness, integrity, and taking care of the people who worked for me and the community that supported my business. I was married to my beloved wife Margaret for 48 years before she passed away from cancer 3 years ago, leaving me alone in the large house we'd built together and shared with our children and grandchildren for decades. Margaret and I raised 3 children together: my daughter Susan, my son Robert, and my younger son David. All 3 of them grew up to be successful, responsible adults who built good lives for themselves and their families, though their approaches to parenting and their relationships with their own children varied significantly in ways that would become important to this story. Susan became a nurse and married a doctor named Paul, and together they raised 2 daughters who are now successful professionals in their own right. Robert became an engineer and married his college sweetheart Linda, and they have 1 son who's currently serving in the military overseas. David, my youngest son, became a high school teacher and coach, and he married a woman named Carol who worked as a social worker before becoming a stay-at-home mother to raise their 2 children. My granddaughter Emma, who's now 25 and working as a veterinarian, and my grandson Tyler, who's 22 and has been nothing but trouble and disappointment since he turned 18. Tyler is the youngest of my 5 grandchildren, and for most of his childhood, he was a sweet, curious boy who loved spending time with Margaret and me at our house, helping with yard work and home improvement projects, and listening to stories about the old days and the family history. Tyler seemed to genuinely enjoy our company and was always eager to learn about construction, business, and the values of hard work and responsibility that had shaped our family's success over the generations. Margaret and I both believed that Tyler had the potential to become a fine young man who would contribute positively to society and maintain the family traditions of integrity and community service that we tried to instill in all our children and grandchildren. But something changed in Tyler's personality and behavior when he reached his late teenage years, and the sweet, respectful boy we'd known and loved gradually transformed into an angry, entitled young man who seemed to resent everything about our family's values and expectations. Tyler began displaying attitudes and behaviors that were completely foreign to how he'd been raised and how the rest of our family conducted themselves. He became obsessed with social media, video games, and online communities that seemed to promote selfishness, disrespect for authority, and contempt for older generations. Tyler started expressing opinions that were shocking in their callousness and cruelty, particularly toward elderly people and anyone he considered to be outdated or irrelevant to modern society. Tyler's transformation was particularly painful for Margaret and me to witness, because we'd invested so much time and energy in building a relationship with him, and because his new attitude seemed to represent a complete rejection of everything, we tried to teach him about respect, compassion, and family loyalty. Tyler would make cruel comments about elderly neighbors, mock older relatives at family gatherings, and express frustration that older generations were taking up resources that should be available to younger people. These attitudes were not only morally reprehensible, but also completely contrary to the values that David and Carol had tried to instill in their children, and they seemed to come from external influences rather than from Tyler's upbringing or family environment. The situation with Tyler became even more troubling after Margaret's death, when his behavior toward me became increasingly hostile and disrespectful. Instead of showing compassion for my grief or offering support during one of the most difficult periods of my life, Tyler seemed to view Margaret's death as an opportunity to express his contempt for me more openly and to push for changes in our family dynamics that would benefit him financially. Tyler began making comments about how I was too old to live alone and how the family needed to make decisions about my living situation and my financial affairs. These comments were clearly motivated by Tyler's desire to gain access to my wealth and property rather than by genuine concern for my well-being or safety. Tyler's behavior reached a new low about 6 months ago when he began making increasingly direct and cruel comments about my age and my continued existence. During family gatherings, Tyler would make jokes about how I was using up oxygen that younger people needed, how I was taking up space in a world that belonged to his generation, and how society would be better off if older people would just get out of the way instead of clinging to life and resources. These comments were made in front of other family members, including his parents and his sister Emma, but Tyler seemed to believe that his youth and his status as the family's youngest member gave him the right to express these vicious opinions without facing serious consequences. The final straw came during what turned out to be our last conversation, before I decided to take drastic action to teach Tyler a lesson about respect and the consequences of cruelty toward elderly family members. Tyler had come to my house supposedly to help me with some yard work, but it quickly became clear that he was actually there to pressure me about making changes to my will and my estate planning. Tyler began the conversation by complaining about how difficult it was for young people to get ahead in today's economy, and how unfair it was that older generations were hoarding wealth, instead of sharing it with family members who needed it more. This was a familiar refrain from Tyler, who seemed to believe that my money and property should be available to him simply because he was young and I was old, regardless of whether he'd done anything to earn or deserve financial support from me. But then Tyler's complaints took a much darker and more personal turn, as he began attacking me directly for what he saw as my selfishness and my failure to recognize that my time had passed, and I should step aside for younger generations. Tyler told me that I was being selfish by continuing to live in a large house that could be better used by a young family, that I was wasting money on health care and living expenses that could be better spent on his generation's needs, and that I was generally taking up space and resources that would be better utilized by people who had their whole lives ahead of them. These comments were hurtful enough, but Tyler wasn't finished expressing his true feelings about my continued existence and my place in his life and in society. The conversation reached its shocking climax when Tyler looked me directly in the eye and said, "Honestly, Grandpa, the world would be better without old people like you taking up space. You should just die already and stop being a burden on everyone around you. Nobody really wants you here anymore, and you're just making everyone's life more difficult by hanging around when your time is up." The words hit me like a physical blow, not just because of their cruelty, but because they revealed the depth of Tyler's contempt for me and for elderly people in general. This wasn't just a young person expressing frustration or speaking thoughtlessly in a moment of anger. This was a calculated and deliberate expression of Tyler's belief that I had no value as a human being, and that my death would be a positive development for him and for society. Tyler's statement made it clear that he viewed me not as his grandfather who had loved and supported him throughout his life, but as an obstacle to his own desires and ambitions, someone whose continued existence was inconvenient and unwanted. After Tyler left that day, I sat in my empty house and thought long and hard about what he'd said, and what it revealed about his character and his feelings toward me and toward elderly people in general. I realized that Tyler's cruelty wasn't likely to improve with time or gentle correction, and that his attitudes toward aging and elderly family members represented a fundamental moral failing that needed to be addressed in a dramatic and unforgettable way. Tyler clearly believed that elderly people like me were expendable, and that our deaths would be welcomed by younger generations who would benefit from our absence. I decided to give Tyler exactly what he claimed to want and see how he would react when faced with the reality of my death and the consequences of his cruel words and attitudes. The plan I developed was elaborate and required careful coordination with several trusted friends and professionals, but I was determined to create a situation that would force Tyler to confront the reality of his wishes and reveal his true character to our entire family. I began by consulting with my lawyer, my doctor, and my longtime friend and business partner Frank, explaining my situation with Tyler and my desire to teach him a lesson about respect and the consequences of treating elderly people with cruelty and contempt. All three men were shocked by Tyler's behavior and supportive of my plan to fake my death and observe how Tyler and the rest of my family would react to my supposed passing. My lawyer helped me draft a fake will that would be read at my supposed funeral, while my doctor provided medical documentation that would support the story of my sudden death from a heart attack. Frank agreed to help coordinate the practical aspects of faking my death and organizing a funeral service where I could observe Tyler's reaction without being recognized. The first step in executing my plan was to stage my supposed death in a way that would be believable and would allow me to disappear from public view long enough to observe the family's reactions and the funeral proceedings. I arranged to be found by my housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, who was in on the plan and who would discover my body and call the appropriate authorities to report my death. Mrs. Patterson had worked for Margaret and me for over 15 years and was like family to us, so she was shocked and angered by Tyler's treatment of me and eager to help expose his true character to the rest of the family. On the appointed day, Mrs. Patterson arrived at my house according to our planned schedule and discovered me unconscious in my study, immediately calling 911 and reporting that I appeared to have suffered a fatal heart attack. The paramedics who responded to the call were actually friends of mine from my volunteer work with the local fire department, and they were prepared to transport me to a private medical facility where I could remain hidden while the family dealt with the news of my death and made arrangements for my funeral. The story of my sudden death from a heart attack was believable because I did have a history of heart problems and was at an age where sudden cardiac events would not be surprising to family members or medical professionals. Frank took charge of communicating the news of my death to my children and grandchildren, calling each of them individually to inform them of my passing and to begin making arrangements for my funeral and the reading of my will. Frank had been my business partner and closest friend for over 30 years, so his role as the person handling my final affairs seemed natural and appropriate to everyone in the family. Frank reported back to me about each family member's reaction to the news of my death, providing detailed accounts of their emotional responses and their immediate concerns about funeral arrangements and my estate. The reactions varied significantly among my children and grandchildren, in ways that were both heartening and deeply disappointing. My daughter Susan was devastated by the news and immediately began making arrangements to travel home for the funeral, expressing grief and regret that she hadn't spent more time with me in recent months. My son Robert, despite being stationed overseas with the military, managed to arrange emergency leave to attend my funeral and expressed genuine sorrow about losing his father. My younger son David, Tyler's father, was also deeply affected by my supposed death and seemed to feel guilty about not having done more to address Tyler's disrespectful behavior toward me in recent months. My granddaughter Emma was heartbroken by the news and spoke movingly about how much I'd meant to her and how much she would miss our conversations and our relationship. But Tyler's reaction to learning about my death was everything I'd feared and expected based on his recent behavior and attitudes toward me. According to Frank's report, Tyler's first response to hearing about my death was not grief or sadness, but rather excitement and curiosity about my will and the distribution of my estate. Tyler immediately began asking questions about when the will would be read, what provisions I'd made for different family members, and whether there would be any delays in distributing my assets to my heirs. Tyler's focus on the financial implications of my death rather than on the loss of his grandfather revealed the extent to which he viewed me as a source of money rather than as a family member worthy of love and respect. Even more disturbing was Tyler's behavior in the days following the announcement of my death, as he began making plans for how he would spend what he assumed would be his inheritance from my estate. Tyler started researching expensive cars and luxury items that he wanted to purchase, and he began bragging to his friends about the windfall he expected to receive from his grandfather's death. Frank reported that Tyler seemed genuinely excited about my death and showed no signs of grief or regret about the cruel things he'd said to me in our final conversation. Tyler's behavior confirmed my worst fears about his character and proved that his cruelty toward me had been sincere rather than just youthful thoughtlessness or temporary anger. The funeral arrangements proceeded according to my plan, with Frank working with the funeral home to create a service that would allow me to observe the proceedings without being recognized by family members or other attendees. I would be present at my own funeral wearing a disguise and sitting in the back row where I could see and hear everything that happened without being noticed by Tyler or other family members. The funeral home director was an old friend who understood my situation and was willing to help me carry out my plan to observe Tyler's behavior during what he believed was my actual funeral service. Frank arranged for my body to be present in a closed casket, explaining to the family that my appearance had been too damaged by the heart attack to allow for an open casket service. The day of my funeral was both surreal and enlightening, as I sat in the back of the chapel wearing a wig, glasses, and clothing that disguised my appearance while I watched my family and friends gather to supposedly mourn my passing. The service was well attended, with dozens of former employees, business associates, and community members coming to pay their respects to my memory and to offer condolences to my family. Many people shared touching stories about their relationships with me and the positive impact I'd had on their lives, which was deeply moving even though I knew the whole situation was staged. Watching my children and most of my grandchildren express genuine grief and love for me was both heartwarming and guilt-inducing, as I realized how much pain my fake death was causing people who truly cared about me. But observing Tyler's behavior during the funeral confirmed all of my suspicions about his true character and his feelings about my death. While other family members wept and shared memories of our relationships, Tyler sat in the front row checking his phone, looking bored, and occasionally smirking when he thought no one was watching him. During the portion of the service when family members were invited to share memories and speak about my life, Tyler declined to participate, claiming he was too emotional to speak publicly about his grief. But his body language and facial expressions made it clear that he felt no genuine sadness about my death and was simply going through the motions of appearing to grieve for the sake of social expectations and family harmony. The most revealing moment came during the reception after the funeral service, when I overheard Tyler talking to some of his friends who had attended the service to support him during his supposed time of grief. Tyler told his friends that he was relieved that I was finally gone because I'd been holding the family back with my old-fashioned attitudes and my reluctance to share my wealth with younger generations. Tyler joked that my death was long overdue, and that he was looking forward to finally getting what was rightfully his from my estate. Tyler's friends seemed uncomfortable with his callous attitude toward his grandfather's death, but Tyler appeared oblivious to their reactions and continued making cruel comments about how my death would benefit him and improve his life prospects. Hearing Tyler celebrate my death and express relief about my passing was painful beyond words, but it also confirmed that my plan to expose his true character was working exactly as intended. Tyler was revealing himself to be exactly the kind of cruel, selfish person I'd suspected him to be, and his behavior at my funeral would be remembered by everyone who witnessed it. The reading of my supposed will was scheduled for the day after the funeral, giving Tyler one more night to fantasize about his expected inheritance and to make plans for spending money that he believed would soon be his. Frank reported that Tyler had barely slept the night after the funeral, not because of grief or emotional distress, but because of excitement about learning the details of my estate and discovering how much money he would inherit. Tyler had apparently spent hours online researching expensive purchases and calculating how much he could afford to spend on luxury items once he received his inheritance from my estate. The morning of the will reading, Tyler arrived at the lawyer's office early and seemed barely able to contain his excitement as family members gathered to hear the distribution of my assets. Tyler kept checking his watch and fidgeting in his chair, clearly eager to learn about his inheritance and to begin making plans for spending his newfound wealth. The other family members present were still grieving my supposed death and seemed focused on honoring my memory rather than on the financial implications of my passing, which made Tyler's obvious excitement even more inappropriate and revealing. My lawyer began the will reading by explaining that I had made some unusual provisions in my final will and testament, and that there were some surprises that family members should be prepared for. Tyler leaned forward in his chair, apparently assuming that the surprises would be generous gifts or special provisions that would benefit him beyond his normal inheritance. The lawyer continued reading through various bequests to charities and gifts to longtime employees and friends, building toward the major distribution of my estate among family members. Tyler grew increasingly impatient as the lawyer worked through these preliminary items, clearly eager to hear about his own inheritance and frustrated by what he saw as unnecessary delays in getting to the important financial information. Finally, the lawyer reached the section of the will dealing with distributions to family members, beginning with generous but appropriate gifts to my children and my other grandchildren. Susan, Robert, and David each received substantial inheritances that would provide financial security and comfort for the rest of their lives, while Emma and my other grandchildren received smaller but still significant amounts that would help them with education expenses, home purchases, or other major life expenses. Tyler listened to these distributions with growing excitement, apparently calculating that if other family members were receiving such generous gifts, his own inheritance would be even larger since he was the youngest grandchild and had presumably been my favorite. But when the lawyer reached Tyler's name in the will, the provision was unlike anything he had expected or prepared for. Instead of a large cash inheritance or valuable property, Tyler was bequeathed a single item, a mirror, along with a note explaining that the mirror was intended to help him reflect on his treatment of elderly family members and consider whether he was proud of the person he saw looking back at him. The will went on to explain that Tyler's cruel behavior toward me and his expressed wish for my death had disqualified him from receiving any financial inheritance, and that his portion of the estate would instead be donated to organizations that provided care and support for elderly people who had been abandoned or mistreated by their families. Tyler's reaction to learning about his inheritance was immediate and explosive, as he began shouting that the will was fake and that I couldn't have been serious about leaving him nothing but a mirror and a lecture about his behavior. Tyler demanded that the lawyer explain how I could have excluded him from my estate, and insisted that there must be some mistake or some additional provision that would give him access to the money he believed he deserved. The lawyer calmly explained that the will was legally valid, and that Tyler's inheritance consisted only of the mirror and the accompanying message about reflection and personal growth. Tyler's rage and disappointment were obvious to everyone present, but what was most revealing was his complete lack of shame or remorse about the behavior that had led to his exclusion from my estate. Instead of reflecting on his cruel treatment of me, or considering whether he might have deserved the consequences he was facing, Tyler focused entirely on his anger about losing access to money that he'd never actually earned or been promised. Tyler's reaction to his inheritance proved that he had learned nothing from my supposed death, and that his attitudes toward elderly people and family relationships remained as selfish and cruel as they had been during our final conversation. But the biggest surprise of the day was yet to come, as the lawyer announced that there was one final provision in my will that required my personal presence to execute. The lawyer explained that I had requested to deliver a final message to my family from beyond the grave, and that arrangements had been made for this message to be shared during the will reading. Tyler and the other family members were confused by this announcement, but they agreed to wait for whatever final communication I had prepared for them. At that moment, I walked into the lawyer's office, very much alive and ready to deliver my final message to Tyler and the rest of my family. The shock and confusion on everyone's faces was immediate and overwhelming, but Tyler's reaction was the most extreme as he struggled to process the fact that the grandfather whose death he'd been celebrating was standing in front of him very much alive. I calmly explained to my family that I had faked my death in order to observe their true reactions to my passing, and to see who would mourn my loss genuinely, and who would simply celebrate their expected financial gains. I told them about Tyler's cruel words to me before my supposed death, about his behavior during the funeral and reception, and about his obvious excitement over his expected inheritance, rather than grief over losing his grandfather. I explained that Tyler's wish for my death had inspired me to give him exactly what he thought he wanted, so that he could experience the reality of living in a world without his grandfather, and see how that reality compared to his fantasies. The revelation that I was alive and had been observing their behavior throughout my supposed death and funeral created a range of reactions among my family members. My children and my other grandchildren were initially relieved and happy to discover that I was alive, but they were also hurt and confused about why I had put them through the pain of believing I was dead. Emma was particularly emotional, explaining how much grief and regret she'd experienced thinking that I was gone, and how difficult it had been to imagine life without me in it. My children expressed similar feelings, describing how my supposed death had made them realize how much they valued our relationships and how much they would miss having me in their lives. But Tyler's reaction to discovering that I was alive was completely different from the rest of the family's response, revealing even more about his character and his true feelings toward me. Instead of relief or happiness that his grandfather was still alive, Tyler's first reaction was anger and embarrassment that he'd been tricked and exposed. Tyler immediately began shouting that I had no right to fake my death and spy on the family, and that my actions had been cruel and manipulative. Tyler seemed most upset about the fact that his behavior had been observed and reported to other family members, rather than being ashamed of the behavior itself or sorry for the pain his words and attitudes had caused me. Tyler's focus on his own embarrassment rather than on the impact of his cruelty toward me proved that he still didn't understand the severity of his behavior or the hurt he'd caused to someone who had loved and supported him throughout his life. Tyler also immediately began demanding that I change my will and give him the inheritance he believed he deserved, arguing that his exclusion from my estate was unfair and vindictive. Tyler seemed to believe that discovering I was alive meant that everything would return to normal, and that there would be no permanent consequences for his cruel treatment of me or his celebration of my supposed death. Tyler's demands for his inheritance and his inability to acknowledge his own wrongdoing showed that he had learned absolutely nothing from the experience of believing I was dead, and that his fundamental attitudes toward elderly people and family relationships remained unchanged. The conversation that followed my revelation was difficult and emotional for everyone involved, but it was also necessary for establishing new boundaries and expectations for Tyler's future relationship with our family. I explained to Tyler that his cruel words and his celebration of my supposed death had permanently damaged our relationship, and that he would need to demonstrate genuine remorse and significant changes in his behavior before I would consider rebuilding any meaningful connection with him. I also made it clear that the provisions of my actual will would reflect Tyler's treatment of me, and that his inheritance would indeed be limited, unless he could prove that he had developed genuine respect for elderly people and understanding of the value of family relationships. My children and other grandchildren supported my decision to hold Tyler accountable for his behavior, though they also encouraged me to leave open the possibility of forgiveness and reconciliation if Tyler could demonstrate genuine change and growth. The aftermath of my fake death and the revelation of Tyler's true character had lasting effects on our family dynamics and relationships. Tyler initially continued to insist that he had done nothing wrong, and that my actions had been more cruel than anything he had said or done to me. Tyler seemed to believe that his youth entitled him to express whatever opinions he wanted about elderly people without facing serious consequences, and that family members should automatically forgive and forget his hurtful behavior simply because he was young and family. But as time passed, and Tyler realized that his behavior had real and lasting consequences for his relationships and his financial future, he began to show some signs of reflection and possible remorse. Tyler's parents, David and Carol, were mortified by their son's behavior and began working with a family counselor to address Tyler's attitudes toward aging and elderly people. They also implemented consequences and expectations for Tyler's behavior that made it clear that his cruel treatment of family members would not be tolerated or excused because of his age. The process of rebuilding trust and relationships after Tyler's cruel behavior and my dramatic response was slow and difficult, but it was necessary for establishing healthier family dynamics and ensuring that elderly family members would be treated with appropriate respect and dignity. Tyler eventually began participating in volunteer work with elderly people in nursing homes and community centers, which helped him develop greater understanding and empathy for the challenges and experiences of older adults. This volunteer work was part of a broader effort to help Tyler understand the value and dignity of elderly people, and to see them as individuals with rich histories and ongoing contributions to make to their families and communities. Over the course of several months, Tyler's attitudes and behavior began to show gradual improvement as he worked with counselors and volunteers to address his prejudices against aging and elderly people. Tyler began to understand that his cruel words and attitudes had been not just hurtful to me personally, but also reflective of broader social prejudices that contribute to the mistreatment and neglect of elderly people throughout society. Tyler's volunteer work brought him into contact with elderly people who had been abandoned or mistreated by their families, helping him understand the real-world consequences of the attitudes he had expressed toward me and other older adults. The most significant breakthrough in Tyler's personal growth came when he met an elderly man at the nursing home who reminded him of me and who had been abandoned by his own grandchildren because they saw him as a burden and an inconvenience. This man shared stories about his life and his contributions to his family and community, helping Tyler understand that elderly people are not just obstacles or burdens, but are individuals with valuable experiences and ongoing potential for meaningful relationships. Tyler began to realize that his treatment of me had been not just cruel but also foolish, since it had cost him the opportunity to learn from my experiences and to benefit from the wisdom and support that I could have provided throughout his life. After nearly a year of counseling, volunteer work, and reflection, Tyler finally approached me with a genuine apology for his cruel behavior and a request for the opportunity to rebuild our relationship. Tyler's apology was detailed and specific, acknowledging the hurt he had caused me and the disrespect he had shown not just to me personally, but to elderly people in general. Tyler also demonstrated his changed attitudes through his continued volunteer work and his advocacy for better treatment of elderly people in our community, showing that his personal growth was genuine and lasting rather than just a temporary effort to win back my favor and his inheritance. The process of rebuilding my relationship with Tyler was gradual and required ongoing demonstration of his changed attitudes and behavior, but it was ultimately successful in creating a new and healthier dynamic between us. Tyler began visiting me regularly and engaging in meaningful conversations about family history, life experiences, and the wisdom that comes with age and experience. Tyler also began seeking my advice and guidance on important life decisions, recognizing that my years of experience in business and family relationships could provide valuable perspective on the challenges he was facing as a young adult. The transformation in Tyler's character and behavior was remarkable and proved that even deeply ingrained prejudices and cruel attitudes can be changed through education, reflection, and genuine commitment to personal growth. Today, nearly 2 years after my fake death and Tyler's cruel words that inspired it, our family has healed from the trauma of that experience and emerged stronger and more united than before. Tyler has become one of my closest family relationships, and our bond is now based on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than on his expectations of financial benefit from our relationship. Tyler continues his volunteer work with elderly people and has become an advocate for better treatment of aging adults in our community, speaking at schools and community organizations about the importance of respecting and valuing elderly people. The experience taught our entire family valuable lessons about the importance of treating elderly family members with respect and dignity, and about the consequences of taking family relationships for granted. My other children and grandchildren gained a deeper appreciation for the time we have together, and for the importance of expressing love and gratitude, while family members are still alive to hear and appreciate those expressions. The fake death also helped our family understand the importance of addressing cruel or disrespectful behavior immediately rather than hoping that such problems will resolve themselves over time. The elaborate plan I carried out to expose Tyler's true character and teach him about the consequences of his cruelty was extreme, but it was also effective in creating lasting change that probably wouldn't have been possible through conventional family discussions or interventions. Tyler's celebration of my supposed death and his focus on financial gain rather than grief proved that his cruel attitudes were deeply ingrained and sincere, requiring dramatic intervention to motivate genuine reflection and change. The experience also demonstrated the power of elderly people to take action to protect themselves and demand respect from family members who might otherwise take advantage of their age or perceived vulnerability. As for my actual will and estate planning, I have now made provisions that reflect the current state of my relationships with all family members, including Tyler's transformed character and renewed respect for elderly people. Tyler will now receive an inheritance that reflects his changed behavior and his genuine efforts to make amends for his previous cruelty, though his portion is structured to support his continued volunteer work and advocacy for elderly people rather than simply providing him with unearned wealth. The most important lesson from this entire experience is that elderly people deserve respect and dignity from their families and from society, and that cruel treatment of aging adults should never be tolerated or excused regardless of the age or circumstances of the people perpetrating such behavior. Tyler's initial attitudes toward me and elderly people in general reflected broader social prejudices that contribute to elder abuse, neglect, and abandonment throughout our society. The dramatic intervention I carried out helped address these attitudes within my own family, but similar education and advocacy efforts are needed throughout our communities to ensure that elderly people are treated with the respect and dignity they deserve. My experience also demonstrates that elderly people have the right and the ability to take action to protect themselves from mistreatment and to demand appropriate behavior from family members who might otherwise take advantage of their age or perceived vulnerability. Faking my death was an extreme measure, but it was effective in exposing Tyler's true character and motivating genuine change in his attitudes and behavior toward elderly people. The satisfaction of watching Tyler's shock and embarrassment when he discovered that his celebration of my death had been observed and documented was immense. But the real reward has been witnessing his genuine transformation into a person who values and respects elderly people and who works to improve their treatment in our community. Tyler learned that elderly people are not disposable objects whose death should be celebrated, but are valuable family members and community contributors who deserve love, respect, and support throughout their lives. The experience taught our entire family that respecting elderly people is not just good manners, but is essential for maintaining the bonds that hold families and communities together across generations. If there's one message I want people to take from my story, it's that cruel treatment of elderly people should never be tolerated or ignored, and that dramatic action may sometimes be necessary to expose such behavior and motivate genuine change. Tyler's wish for my death revealed a fundamental moral failing that required extreme intervention to address, and conventional family discussions or gentle corrections would not have been sufficient to motivate the deep reflection and personal growth that Tyler needed to undergo. My fake death provided Tyler with the opportunity to experience the reality of living in a world without his grandfather, and to see how that reality compared to his cruel fantasies about elderly people being burdens who should disappear. The experience also provided our entire family with valuable lessons about the importance of expressing love and appreciation for elderly family members, while they're still alive to receive and appreciate such expressions. Many families wait until elderly relatives are gone to fully appreciate their value and contributions, but my fake death gave my family the opportunity to experience that loss and then to benefit from having me return to their lives with a renewed understanding of our relationship's importance. The elaborate nature of my plan to fake my death and observe Tyler's reaction required significant coordination and resources, but it was worth the effort to expose Tyler's true character and create lasting change in his attitudes toward elderly people. The plan also provided entertainment and satisfaction for me and my co-conspirators, as we watched Tyler reveal himself to be exactly the kind of cruel, selfish person we'd suspected him to be, while also documenting his behavior for future reference and family discussion. Today, I'm proud of the action I took to address Tyler's cruel behavior and to teach him about the value and dignity of elderly people, and I'm grateful that the experience ultimately led to positive changes in his character and in our family relationships. Tyler has become a better person as a result of confronting the consequences of his cruelty, and our family has become stronger and more united through the process of addressing and overcoming this difficult situation. The fake death was a dramatic and unusual solution to a serious family problem, but it was effective in achieving its goals and creating lasting positive change for everyone involved. If you found this story as incredible as I hope you did, please give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button for more amazing tales of family justice and life lessons. Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts on this grandfather's creative approach to teaching respect, and be sure to click on the next video to hear another unbelievable story of someone who refused to let disrespect go unanswered.